Hello, everyone. My name is Curry Stegan, and I am the host of the Passion for the Paranormal podcast show. Thank you for tuning into the show on my YouTube channel, and please make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can check out other great content that's going to be coming down the road.
Imagine this. It is late one Friday night and you're lying on the couch watching TV and you slowly drift off to sleep. Suddenly, you're jolted awake by what sounds like loud knocking at your front door. You try to quickly collect your thoughts. Is there really someone at the door? You look over at the clock and realize it's well past midnight. You pray the knocking will stop, but it doesn't. You anxiously get to your feet and wonder who could be knocking at your door at this hour, and then you have another thought. Why did they not use the doorbell? You're hesitant to go to the door, but you know you must. Could it be a family emergency? If so, why didn't you get a call? You look at your cell phone and there are no messages or missed calls. You reluctantly decide to put your slippers on and go investigate. You hear what sounds like a young boy saying something but can't quite make it out. As you slowly and nervously make your way down the stairs, the loud knocking continues. As you get to the front door, you stand there wondering what to do. You decide to look through the peephole and you notice that there are two young boys standing at your doorstep. You're frightened, but something compels you to slowly open the door. As you gaze at the young boy at your doorstep, you lock eyes with him, and that's when you notice it. The boy's eyes are piercing and are completely jet black. He asks to be let in and says that they need to use the phone. Part of you feels a complete sense of dread, but strangely and inexplicably, you want to let them in. You suddenly come to your senses and realize that there is something horribly wrong, and you slam the door and tell the boys to go away. The boy demands that you let him in so that they can use the phone. You yell through the door, "I'm going to call the police if you don't leave," but the knocking continues. You yell again, "Get off my doorstep before I call the police," and suddenly the knocking stops. You muster the courage to look through the peephole once again, and you notice that the two boys have suddenly vanished and there is no trace of them. You decide to slowly open the door and have a peek outside, and once again, there is no trace of the boys. This is the story of the black-eyed children.
The opinions and views expressed by the guests of Passion for the Paranormal are not always the views and opinions expressed by the host.
Hello again, and welcome to Passion for the Paranormal, bringing a passion for the paranormal to you. I'm your host, Curry Stegan, and it's so great to be back with you for this special bonus episode. I've got author Gary Michael Vasey joining me, and he's going to be talking with me about the black-eyed kids. This is a subject that in the past I've easily dismissed, but as I've researched and looked into it further, including reading Gary's book about many of the counts people have had with these black-eyed kids or black-eyed people, it is truly a frightening topic, and there's not a lot out there that frightens me when it comes to the paranormal, but this is certainly one of them. If you haven't already, if you could head over to the Facebook page at Passion, the number 4, the Paranormal, and like the page, so facebook.com/passion, the number 4, the Paranormal. If you could like the page there, and if you're using the iTunes app, if you could also subscribe there and offer a review of the show, that's going to help me help other people find the show. Again, we're on Google Play, so you can also subscribe to the show there. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into this discussion with Gary on the black-eyed kids. Again, it is a chilling topic, and I hopefully you can hang in there for this episode, and you'll enjoy this discussion I have with Gary. All right, so my guest today is Gary Michael Vasey, and Gary has written many books on the paranormal and collects true paranormal and haunted stories on his website. And he's joining me today to talk about the frightening topic of the black-eyed kids. And he's coming to me all the way from the Czech Republic. He covers this topic in his 2017 book, The Chilling True Terror of the Black-Eyed Kids, a Monster Compilation. Gary, thank you so much for joining me today.
No problem. Delighted to talk to you.
Yeah, and you know, Gary, this is quite a frightening topic. It's fascinating yet frightening. I've read quite a few stories about it, and then once I got into your book, it's really one of those kind of topics that can really kind of almost keep you awake at night.
Well, I mean, that's to be honest, that's why I haven't written much else since I did the Black-Eyed Kid books, because after writing about them, nothing much has given me the same motivation to write, which has been, I've gone for about 10 months without writing anything. I've corrected that, or will do in the next few days, because I'm putting out a book called Motel Hell, which is about haunted. It's actually going to be kind of interesting because it's taking Yelp and TripAdvisor reviews of hotels around the world. But it took me a long time to get back the interest in the normal story, and I get stories submitted on a daily basis because the Black-Eyed Kids. I don't know, I mean, I grew up experiencing the paranormal. I was very frightened by it, and as I've gotten older, and I guess as I've done what I do today, which is write all these stories and publish these stories that other people's experiences, I've kind of lost a lot of that fear. So it takes something pretty good to frighten me. I mean, I'm the kind of guy that sits in horror movies laughing,
Right.
Because it just doesn't frighten me. And about 3 years ago, I guess, I got a story on My Haunted Life 2, which is my website, as you know, and it was the first Black-Eyed Kid story I'd ever seen. And I read the thing, and I was terrified. I was alone that night in the apartment, and I was expecting a knock on my door any minute. And I'm a smoker on and off. I used to wander out the back porch into the yard where it's pitch black, and have the odd cigarette, when I'm working, when I'm writing.
Sure.
And I literally went out there, I took a couple of drags off the cigarette, and I was freaked out. I was like, no, I'm going back inside. So having gotten that one story, I mean, I've published it on the website, and the next thing I know is the hits to the website were like tenfold what they'd normally been. And I started getting all these other stories. And many of them were equally as scary and frightening. So I started doing some research. I'm the kind of person, if you read my books, they're not all just collections of stories. I do try to kind of come up with ideas and thoughts and do a bit of research around the stories. And so I started doing some research, and I began to realize that this was quite a phenomena. It's called an urban myth, but this is quite a phenomena. And, I came across a lot of stuff on the internet talking about Brian Bethel and what happened to him in Texas. By the way, I spent 17 years in Texas myself. And I started to think, this is not right. These stories didn't start in the late 1980s with Brian Bethel. You can find stories about the Black-Eyed Kids going back to as long as, as far back as you want to go. I mean, they're not called the Black-Eyed Kids, but they're certainly some kind of an entity or part of the human psyche that creates these black-eyed boogeymen that goes back to the earliest possible time, and of course has been used by Hollywood quite effectively to denote demonic or, very nasty people by making their eyes totally black. So there's definitely something to it, and I get quite upset sometimes when I read websites that say this dates back to the beginning of the internet and it's an urban myth. It's not. It doesn't date back to the beginning of the internet. It dates back to the beginnings of humanity, and it's not an urban myth. It is a myth, but there's much more substance to it than just some American Halloween experience that got created by some guy in Texas 30 odd years ago.
Right. in going back, what is the earliest account, based on your research, that you've recorded that sounds like an account that would be like a black-eyed kid?
Yeah, the earliest written accounts, in a recognizable sense, would probably date to, I've found stuff in the 1960s, but I've also got accounts dating back to like the 1920s of strange occurrences where people have run into strange beings by the roadside, for example, that have all black eyes. But then if you go and look into just mythology, you'll find a lot of myth going back, centuries about children in the forest with black eyes that would steal your soul and rob you of your life energy. It's like the black-eyed boogeyman,
Right. And the more recent accounts, like you had covered in your book, they're pretty frightening, and there does seem to be some similarities in the accounts. But can you talk a little bit about some of those similarities that people have reported from all over, particularly it sounds like the United States,
Sure.
But can you talk about some of the similarities in the accounts that people have reported?
Definitely. And there is a flavor to the U.S., the black-eyed kid encounter that's more or less consistent and coherent in all of the so-called experiences. It's not to say that I haven't read accounts from places like Australia and the UK and other countries that are similar, but maybe we'll get to that. There are some differences between the North American variety of the story and other varieties of the story. But in the North American story, the general modus operandi is that there's a knock on the door, usually in the early hours of the morning. The person is surprised to have visitors at that time. They're even more surprised when they realize that the visitors are very small children, usually 8 to 14 years of age. There's probably more than one of them. They seem to be dressed in strange clothing, like suits or dark suits with white shirts, or clothing that is like 18th century or early 19th century. It's a bit off. The clothing is off for the time. And the initial thought, I guess, on the part of the person who's got the knock on the door is one of concern. A couple of young kids out at 2 o'clock in the morning in the middle of nowhere. They've lost their parents. Something's wrong. There's been a road accident. And so the initial sort of thought is one of sympathy. But these kids talk in a monotone. Usually only one of them actually talks. They have a language that is also kind of strange. They might ask to use the telephone, but in 1 or 2 instances ask to use the telegraph, which is a rather strange thing to ask for. Oh, wow. And they're demanding. They want to come in. They have reasons to want to come in, and they will play on that sympathy. And at the same time, the person who's answered the door by now is getting this overwhelming sense of sickness, fear, and anxiety that they can't explain, because after all, what you've got is a couple of young kids stood on the doorstep, and yet this person is by now feeling this sense of complete fear and confusion. There's always like a hypnotic aspect to it as well. This monotone, this repetition is a hypnotic sort of effect, almost as if trying to hypnotize the person and get them to comply. Usually the person is feeling so bad that they're by now very suspicious and not wanting to let these kids in under any circumstances. And at some point in this conversation, they realize that the kids have totally black eyes, jet black eyes, no whites of the eye at all. And they start to really feel this sickness, this sense of foreboding. They want to close the door. They tell the kids to go away. They do close the door. They'll be knocking on the door. The kids will continue to request entry. I want to use the phone. It's urgent. Must use the phone. Our parents have gone. We need to use the phone. And after a while, this knocking and this noise will stop, and the person who answered the door will look outside and find no evidence that anybody was ever there. They can ask the neighbors if they have neighbors. Nobody else saw these kids. So it's almost like an experience that only the person answering the door has. And overall, it's a very, very chilling and very compelling sort of experience.
Gary, are you still with me there?
I am, yeah.
Okay. It sounded like you may have dropped off for a second there. I'm glad you didn't. Yeah, it is just bizarre, these accounts. I cover all kinds of different paranormal topics on the show here, and I can't think of another topic that, where I've read about it, whether it be UFO abductions, haunted cases, poltergeist type activity. We've had a guy on the show talking about some research William Hall he's done on poltergeist cases, and none of these has really been quite as frightening as this one to me. But what do you think? What do you think they want from people? I mean, what are they trying to do?
Well, there's all kinds of theories, of course. Aliens, alien hybrids, demons, all this kind of stuff. But as I continue to do research and look at stories and collect stories, etc., I'm actually coming to some conclusions, broader conclusions, which I basically echo on in my book on basically succubi, incubi, and shadow men. But the idea started to come from the Black-Eyed Kid, which is that maybe there is an entity in some parallel reality that feeds on human fear, feeds on human emotion, feeds on human energy, and they find ways to access that energy that they need. And maybe one way is to manifest as a black-eyed person or a black-eyed kid and steal that energy. But in all of the stories, the key element is let me in, let me in, let me in. And in the occult world, the idea of giving someone permission to cross the threshold is letting them possess you. And so the language speaks to one of wanting to possess you, wanting to steal your energy, wanting to take your energy. And the last thing, if you ever do encounter a black-eyed kid on the doorstep, the very last thing you should do is give them entry or say yes, because you are literally giving them permission to possess you.
Wow. Again, frightening. It's almost kind of along the lines of the vampire folklore about, having to be invited in.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I'm beginning to sort of develop this theory, far-fetched though it may be, that there is an entity that steals our energy, that survives on like a vampire, but not through blood, but through fear energy or human life energy. And the Black-Eyed Kid is one manifestation. I think another manifestation of it is the succubi, incubi, and the night hag, which come along with the sleep paralysis experience. But I don't think sleep paralysis adequately explains the phenomena. I think that sleep paralysis is the way that they create the fear and take advantage of you. So I see Black-Eyed Kids as sort of another manifestation of this sort of vampire of human energy and fear. I mean, one thing I decided a long time ago, having paranormal experiences myself, is the more frightened you are, the worse it becomes. And my father, who also had similar experiences, always told me, get angry. And so my original strategy was to get angry. And of course, when you get angry, you lose the fear, and the phenomenon would go away or diminish in intensity. And these days, I try to just simply refuse to be frightened at all. This does work. So I do feel like the fear helps manifest and encourage this kind of activity. And I think the Black-Eyed Kid is a wonderful way to create this fear environment and feed off the person, the poor person that's entering the door. And of course, if you do let them in, there are very few stories around of people that have let them in. But the stories that I have come across, few and far between, are not particularly pleasant. In one instance, an older couple did let them in, and I think their pets all died. The guy developed cancer. There was another story where the neighbours disappeared after sightings of black-eyed kids in the neighbourhood. And I mean, there are many disappearances of people in the United States and other parts of the world, and many of them are unexplained. So who's to say that they didn't let the black-eyed kids in? You know.
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of nexus there, because there's thousands and thousands of missing person cases that just there's no explanation for, and you have to wonder, is it extraterrestrial related? What is accounting for all these missing people? That there is no evidence, forensic evidence or otherwise. David Paulides is one that's done a lot of research on this. And so it's interesting you mentioned that. The other interesting thing is, based on the accounts, the sketches, and the drawings that have been made of these, there's kind of a similarity to, dare I say, the eyes, the black eyes to the gray aliens. And I know that's kind of a far-fetched one, but I think that's kind of where people have brought in the alien. Maybe they're some sort of alien-human hybrid. But then you brought in the fact that once people, actually let them in, that, they've done harm to people. If you look at abduction cases, I'm not sure that necessarily fits into what's going on there. But yeah, there's so many possibilities here. That's what's so bizarre about it. Has anybody died from this?
Well, I haven't come across any evidence that they have. I've come across evidence that they got sick. In one story, apparently the husband did pass away eventually, but this was from cancer, which appeared after the visit from the black-eyed kids. But it points to, in my opinion, it points to life energy being stolen, and you develop an illness, and then eventually you could succumb to it. But I think that the alien thing probably isn't. It wouldn't be my favourite theory, because if you look at legends and sort of folklore, like Native American folklore, and I may mispronounce it, so I apologise if I do, but the Acharai, which is the girl, the spirit, the little girl that comes from the mountains at night to bring sickness to humans, in sort of Native American culture, they're also depicted with dark eyes, and sometimes referred to as hill fairies. And these things came down from the hills, came into the village, infected people with sickness by stealing their energy, brought death to the elderly, that kind of thing. And there are other examples of this in mythology and folklore of the creatures that lived in the forest, as I mentioned. So to me, it's not like this is new. What's new is the way to propagate the stories, which is the internet and social media. So whereas somebody in the 1950s may have experienced a very similar sort of set of circumstances, at the time it would be very highly unlikely that it got spread, the story or the experience got talked about outside of the local community. Because how would you propagate the story? There was no social media, there was no internet. But now, someone like Brian Bethel has an experience, he posts it on an internet user group or whatever it was, board, and the next thing you know, thousands and thousands of people are talking about it because it's a terrifying experience. And then other people that have had a similar kind of experience start to talk about it too, and before you know it, you've got this, you've got this huge wave of interest on the internet and in social media.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about, maybe just some of the scariest accounts that you've had shared with you, or maybe the most scary account that you can think of that you could share?
Yeah, I mean, I think the general sort of story of kids on the doorstep is scary, but to be honest, the stories that give me the chills are the ones with black-eyed adults, as much as anything else. Because imagine getting on a bus late at night, and you're sitting there, you're the only person on the bus, and then some guy gets on, and he looks fairly ordinary at a distance, is chewing a cigar, and as you look over at him, he catches your eyes. He's got all black eyes, and his teeth are all stained with tobacco and bits of cigar. And he smiles this sickly smile at you. That to me is far more terrifying, because this is out in the ordinary everyday world, and people are meeting these black-eyed people and experiencing these very sinister experiences, out in the ordinary world. And to me, those are the ones that scare me. The other story about the kid whose parents were visited by a salesman who wanted to sell them something but never actually showed them what was in his briefcase, like a door-to-door sales guy type thing. And the little boy is looking at him and seeing that he's got black eyes, no whites at all, and he's being looked at by this individual the whole time. And it kind of freaks him out. His parents eventually buy nothing and get rid of this guy. But then a few weeks later, he's sat home alone, and this same salesman turns up and is peering through the keyhole at the kid who's peering back through the keyhole at the black eye. I mean, that is awfully scary experience.
Right, and
yet
go ahead. I'm sorry.
And yet there's an element of humor because I'm laughing, but I don't think I'd like it if it happened to me. That's for sure.
No, I wouldn't either, and hopefully I wouldn't let them in. But that's the interesting thing about this: if they have this kind of mind control over you. Do you think some of the people that have let them in do you think it's just been that, hey, they feel that they're children and they need to help them out, or have they had such an effect on people that they're just basically, maybe some have been under their mind control and it just let them in against their own will?
I'm sure that has happened, and I think one of the other aspects that maybe I missed earlier on when we talked about the sort of modus operandi is sometimes people are on the verge of letting them in, and then they realize that lights are flickering, electrical disturbances, and something isn't right. So it's kind of common to have electrical disturbances at the same time these kids are around. And most people see the black eyes and they have this horrible sense of doom, and they don't let them in. But you've got to wonder how many people did, and something happened to them, and we've never read the story because there's no one to write the story.
Right. Well, that's the interesting thing. It's kind of like the UFO cases. Some people out there say 1 in 10 is reported. So, how many people have actually experienced these entities and have never reported it, or, like you said, maybe they disappeared, and so we never hear the stories.
Well, I'm sure some people wouldn't talk about it because they would believe that other people wouldn't believe them, and what value would it add?
Right.
I also think there's probably the equal likelihood that other people make some of these stories up in order to create an impression. But even if you made up 90% of the stories, what are the remainder?
Right.
There's so much out there in terms of content and stories that there has to be something real to this, and that's why, as I say, I've developed this idea, this theory, and I'm still developing it, that in our reality that there is some kind of a creature, call it a demon if you will, it depends on what you want to call them, that feeds upon the energy of humanity, and it finds different ways in which to do that. One is as a black-eyed kid or a black-eyed person. Another is as, succubi, incubi, that kind of thing. Shadow men, poltergeist activity. I mean, it may all be, at the end of the day, different forms of the same issue, which is, I need your energy, I need your fear energy, and the best way to get it is to make you frightened.
Right. So have there been certain hot spots or areas from your research where there have been a lot more cases reported than in other areas?
Certainly. I mean, if you look at the U.S., there seem to be an inordinate number of experiences shared from people in the South, so Texas, Kansas, sort of that middle South sort of area of the United States. There seems to be an awful lot of stories from that part of the world, a lot more than, say, California, New York, the coastal areas. So it does seem to come from the middle South predominantly. And, of course, a lot of the stories are U.S. There aren't as many stories outside of the U.S., but the stories that do exist outside of the U.S. are equally strange, that the example I might point to is the Cannock Chase incident in the UK, which was in the Midlands of the UK, and people reported on Cannock Chase, which is like a forest out in the middle of nowhere. People reported coming across a young child, a young girl in the forest, dressed in strange clothes, wanting help, wanting some help, and having no eyes or black eyes, and creating the same kind of fear in the people that met her. And there are some similarities, but of course there are other aspects to that story that are completely different, like it takes place in a forest, that she's not asking to be let in because she's not knocking on the door. But those stories do exist. Those experiences have been had by people in other parts of the world that are very similar, but not necessarily totally the same.
Now, would it be fair to say that more of the reports are coming from urban type settings, or are they just across the board, suburban, urban?
No, it seems like it's across the board. Some come from urban, some come from non-urban. The most frightening ones, I always think, are the ones that come from the countryside, because it's usually a house there's no neighbours, and it's pitch black, I'm sure. So those are the scary ones. But no, there's plenty of stories about black-eyed people in broad daylight, black-eyed kids in broad daylight in cities. It doesn't seem to be, particular set of circumstances. It appears to be fairly widespread.
Interesting. And of the cases that you've examined or been reported to you, have the majority been children? Because you mentioned there's been other cases of adults, and you include some of those in the book as well. But has the majority of these been the children that have been reported?
No, it's about 50-50. About 50% of the stories are like the Brian Bethel, the kids, not just wanting entrance to the house, but wanting into the car in that instance. And there's several stories submitted to our website that talked about wanting to get in the car as well as in the house. But there's just as many, and the black-eyed people stories to me are are the more frightening, because, as I say, they take place in a normal, everyday sort of environment. I mean, I've got one in front of me now where in Indianapolis, 1988, which is just around the time that Brian Bethel put his story out, I believe. And he's talking about going to the ATM to get some cash out, and he comes across this guy in a black suit, open collar, white, tall, jet black hair. But then he realizes that the eyes are completely jet black, and he's staring across a very crowded intersection with a smug look on his face, staring at the guy that's gone to the ATM, and then starts to follow him down the street back to the club. And this is where, that would really just freak me out, because this is just random scaring on a normal day, surrounded by other people. That to me is the scary thing, as much as anything else, that you're surrounded by other people having this horrible experience. Another story of, by the way, a lot of stories take place in Walmart parking lots. So I don't really want to say this, but I would avoid Walmart parking lots like the plague, because a lot of stories seem to be set there. And there was a great one that gave me a scary time, was where I think it was a woman was walking through the parking lot, and there was a homeless person sat on the curb, and as she passed, the homeless person called her by her name. Her went around, looked at the homeless person, and met the jet black eyes of a black-eyed person, and freaked out. That's terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about how many people who are having these experiences, how many of them are continuing to have residual effects of them, whether it be nightmares or having recurring accounts? Can you talk about that aspect of it a little bit?
I mean, I can't. A lot of the stories that are submitted, we can't necessarily follow up with the person, or there's a reluctance to do so. But in a number of situations, obviously there has been some trauma associated with the experience. and they obviously spend time in fear that it's going to happen again, or that they'll meet these people on the street. But the stories where somebody has really been harmed physically or mentally are few and far between. There's not many of them. And in those stories, usually they develop some kind of an illness like a cancer or something, or their pets die, or their relatives die. In one instance, the black-eyed kids actually told the person, "You are going to die," and he got very sick, went into hospital, but did in fact recover. So it depends, but it does seem that the life energy is sucked out of these people, and then they're exposed to developing illnesses as a result of this.
Interesting. So in the book, you also mention there's been reports of not just black-eyed kids or black-eyed people, but also white-eyed kids or people.
Yeah, that's a really weird thing that as these stories were coming in, and we would post them, and more would come in almost the next day. And then we finally got a couple of stories come in that were really quite peculiar, because they sort of spoke to some kind of hierarchy, or maybe even some kind of battle going on, where in one instance, one where the guy was being followed by this black-eyed person, and another person touched him on the shoulder, who was entirely white with white hair, white eyes, and said, "Don't worry about this. We've got it under control." The black-eyed person backed away with a scowl, and the white-eyed person followed them. And there's a couple of stories that were submitted to us where these white-eyed people step in and sort of rescue and intimidate the black-eyed person. On the other hand, it was also something that turned up during the research, is that if you look at the hierarchy of demons and demonology, the black is the color of the lowest, and white is the color of the higher ranking demon. So an alternate theory is that they're both the same creature, but one is much more powerful than the other, though why one would chase away the black-eyed variety still remains a mystery, if that's the case.
Wow, yeah, that's fascinating. The other question I would ask is, have you found in some of the research you've done, there seems to be, and I've covered this in other shows, there seem to be certain areas, particularly that I'm thinking of in the United States, where there seem to be, higher levels of paranormal activity. I don't know if, there's theories out there, some areas may be paranormal vortexes, that sort of thing. Paranormal flaps, I think some people have called them, ley lines. Have you found that some of the accounts that have occurred have occurred in areas where there have been a lot of other paranormal type events or accounts?
Yeah, if I look at all of the stories generally that are submitted, we do seem to get a lot more from the southern U.S. And I would say, Texas, the Gulf Coast there, and sort of on up into the sort of Mississippi area. And that seems to be the case across the board. It just seems to be an area that experiences a lot more activity generally than others. And certainly that's where a lot of these black-eyed kid stories come from. There's no doubt that it's that particular region. I'm just looking at another one here as we speak, and this one's pretty creepy. It's one of the last in the book, but it takes place in Louisiana, for example, in 2012 at a gas station, where at 3 o'clock in the morning, three young kids on bikes suddenly show up, and they ask the attendant to use the phone. And the attendant hands over his cell phone, and the little girl says, "No, I need a real one," pointing at the landline inside. So again, she's asking to get inside. She's not asking for the phone. She's asking to get inside. Eventually, they disappear into the darkness. But in the morning, the attendant wants to check the surveillance footage from the camera and finds that a power outage had cut the cameras off just at the time the kids showed up. So again, you've got the electrical issues occurring at the same time the kids appear.
Wow, interesting.
There's some really interesting. I look at the stories. I mean, they all do have a sort of general, like I call it, a modus operandi. But there's some incredible sort of slight differences in some of the stories that keep it interesting. Things like the gas station, trying to get into a car, causing a car accident. In fact, in another story in which someone unfortunately passed away when they were struck by a truck. So there's a lot of sort of peripheral variation in the stories, but the general theme is always similar, if you follow me.
Right. And there's one account that you mentioned in the book, and it's a husband and wife, and they're getting out of their car, and they see these black-eyed children, and my recollection of the story, the specifics may be a little bit fuzzy, but it was something to the effect that they wanted a ride to a certain location, and I think they even mentioned an address. Does this sound familiar? The one I'm mentioning here, and I believe in the account.
It does, yeah.
In the account, they actually there was a weird connection with the address later on down the road. Can you talk a little bit about that case for the listeners? Because I thought that one was quite fascinating.
Sorry, you cut out. Just there's a connection with.
Yeah, so the connection with the address, so it's a husband and wife, and I believe this occurred in somewhere in New York City, and there was actually a specific address mentioned, and then down the road there was actually some significance to the address that they were wanting to go to.
Unfortunately, I don't recall the exact story that you're talking about. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. It was something to the effect that it was an address that, if I remember the account correctly, the address given was one of an address that they had later relocated to or moved to. This couple, it was something along the lines of that, and I thought it was quite...
Could be, yeah. Almost like a prediction, yeah.
Yes, like they were...
I remember that one vaguely as well. I mean, I've had so many of these stories, I can't remember them all.
Yeah, I'm sure they run together after a while.
I do have the book open in front of me, but I don't see that one at the moment.
Yeah, that was a fascinating one. Any other...
well, maybe I found it.
Any other accounts there that you can think of where these beings have actually more or less... They more or less told the future of some event that's going to occur? Any other ones that you can think of where that sort of thing has happened?
Yeah. I found it. It's you're right. It's set in New York, and basically they have this experience of meeting these kids. The husband spoke to the kids more than anything else, and then years later, they're looking to move into a new house, and when the husband sees the address of the house, it was the same address the boys had told him about outside of his office, which kind of indicates that they have some kind of predictive time-jumping abilities, which is another reason to generate fear.
Yes, absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd forgot about that one. It's a good one.
It is, yeah. I thought that one was quite interesting. Have you had any other cases reported to you where there's strange things like that, where they've told people something and then later it happens, or or is that kind of unique, that case there?
Well, I mean, the one where the black-eyed boy says to the guy, you're going to die soon, and basically almost immediately afterwards he goes to the doctor for tests, and they found out he has a cancer tumor. So he goes into surgery, but he does survive. And in this instance, he thinks the kids caused it, but he does also suggest that they seem to have some kind of telepathic capability, because sometimes the voices speak in your head, and in this instance, he's think that as the encounter happens, he's thinking, what's happening here? And he hears in his head from one of the kids, you know he isn't real, don't you? So, his thought is answered by a thought that seems to come from the black-eyed kid on the doorstep. So there's also this idea that there's a telepathic as well as a sort of potential future seeing aspect to them. I mean, the black-eyed kids are really the perfect sort of Halloween boogeyman because they have everything, don't they? They really do incur this utter sense of fear, and part of it is because they're kids, and that's a shock that kids might be evil. But it's, in my opinion, it really is a modern manifestation of something that's been around for a long time, and I think that the manifestation kind of fits the culture. So when you look at the different stories that emanate from different parts of the world, like the Cannock Chase versus the kid on the doorstep, maybe this is just an element of culture in the UK versus the United States,
Yeah, right. It's interesting.
But it's the same being manifesting and causing the issue.
Right. And the manifestation of being children certainly would make sense if we think these are some sort of malevolent type beings, because it would certainly seem to reason that if people see children and they think they're in need, they're going to be more willing possibly to let them in or try to help them. Although when they show up at 2 o'clock at night, man, there are not too many children roaming around neighborhoods at 2 o'clock at night beating on people's doors. So, certainly not in my neighborhood.
It's not a nice experience to have, I'm sure. But one thing I did one day was I tried to think, if you wanted to create an urban myth, what could you actually come up with? And I couldn't come up with anything more terrifying than black-eyed kids.
Right.
There isn't anything, to me, more terrifying than the black-eyed kids, because there's everything that the fact that they're children, the black eyes, the feeling of having your energy sucked away, hypnotic effect, wanting to come in, then getting pretty, if you shut the door on them, knocking and shouting for several minutes until it just disappears completely. And then once it's gone, they've gone. It's like they were never there. I think it must be a terrifying experience. And so far, I'm lucky enough not to have had it. Although they do say that if you know about them, it will happen to you.
Oh, boy. Yeah, I do remember reading something about that, and that was a little bit unsettling in and of itself, because I thought, well, now I know of them. I sure hope that I don't have to experience it. I've been doing paranormal investigating for a number of years, and, like I said, I've never really, I think you mentioned this too, you got to the point where not a lot frightens you. And I can't say I've had any really negative things happen to me. But as I read these accounts, I'm like, well, yeah, just as you've just alluded to, there's not anything I could think of that would be much more of a frightening type situation than paranormal type situation than this one. It's certainly one that would...
As I say, I'm sat here with the book in front of me on Kindle, so I can flick through it, and I just came across another interesting story that I barely recollected. I was looking for it while you were talking, because this is one in the United Kingdom, in Nottingham, and it dates to the 1950s, which is well before the Brian Bethel incident that made this all famous. And it's a similar story, but it's not the same. In this instance, there's a knock at the door late at night. There's a dark figure standing in front of the door that seems to have no face. Looking into the face is like looking into a pitch black hole. And everybody in the house is frozen with fear. The figure knocks on the door multiple times, and eventually they open the door and find a man with a pale white face standing there who says nothing and doesn't move, and has no eyes at all, just black holes where the eyes should be. And as soon as the eyes have been seen, the figure just disappears. It's there for several minutes and then just vanishes into thin air. And this takes place in the 1950s. So there are some similarities there are some differences, but it's still a similar sort of story. So I think it's interesting, that these stories have been around for quite a long time. Maybe the story modus operandi as a whole is getting told better now, but in the past there certainly was such a phenomenon.
Right.
If you understand me.
Right, and it does sound similar. One of the other, I think, maybe frightening or really fascinating aspects of this is the fact that, and I think we touched on it a little bit, but the fact that they just appear to have no emotion. I mean, they seem to be emotionless beings who, just have an agenda and that sort of thing. So I think that also kind of, it speaks to the mystery of this and kind of the frightening aspect of it, as they just seem to have no emotion whatsoever.
Yeah, and this is why, in my thinking, they are some sort of entity, call it a demon if you want, some sort of entity that's non-human. And of course, actually, the one thing we haven't mentioned is that in doing the research, I came across, very interestingly enough, a whole bunch of stories about psychotic people developing black eyes during, if they were raging, angry, almost as if they were momentarily possessed, they would develop black eyes. And it's well documented in the psychological literature. I think I even quote one in the book as an example. So, in that instance, is it possible that the person is, to me, it's like this entity that sucks on human life force energy for its existence has attached itself to a person and momentarily can take over that person in their rage and show itself through the eyes. And, is this a semi-possessed person? Are the kids possessed? Or are they some kind of is it an entity that can look like the way it wants to look? And I think there's still a lot of work to be done. And the more stories, the better, because the more experiences, genuine experiences that we get submitted, the more we can look at this and explore it. But to my mind, again, I think that in our reality there are many other kinds of entities, but there is some kind of an entity that can and does live off of our energy. They can possess us. They can steal our soul. And black-eyed kids, black-eyed people is one variety of that same entity. And I know you don't necessarily want to talk about succubi and incubi and nocturnal visits from the old hag, etc. But if like me, you spend a lot of time plowing through these stories and doing a lot of research, you start to see the similarities. There are some real similarities in these stories. The shadow people, there are some real similarities in the sense that there's an element of taking your life force from you. In one instance, it's through sleep paralysis. In the other instance, it's showing up on your doorstep and asking to be let in.
Wow. Yeah. It certainly is, again, fascinating and frightening altogether. I think as I initially had heard stories about this, I had kind of written this subject off and just thought, it's folklore, it's that sort of thing. But as I started to delve into this further, there does certainly seem to be something to this, and there seems to be a lot of similarities in the accounts. Hey, Gary, I thank you so much for coming on and joining me and talking to me about this. Do you have any further work you think will be coming out? Any further books you're going to do on this subject or related subjects?
Yeah, I think not yet on this subject. The next book is the first real book I've put out in a while. It should be out next week on Kindle, and it'll be called Motel Hell. With some kind of subtitle, but it's about haunted hotels through reviews that people leave on the internet. That's my next book. But I am working slowly on the idea of building out the theory of the entity that preys on humanity and manifests itself in different guises as the black-eyed kids, black-eyed people, the old hag, succubi, incubi, shadow people. And we've even got a working title for it. That will come out probably sometime in 2019, but I'm still in the pre-writing research stage, so a lot of work to do yet.
So for people, you've written a lot of books on the paranormal. I found a lot of them there on Amazon. But if people want to get more information about your work, your books, your writings, or they want to share haunted stories or stories about black-eyed kids or similar type of things, how do they reach out? How do they reach out to you?
Couple of places. If they go to my personal website, which is GaryMVasey.com or GMichaelVasey.com, it's the same website. They can get a look at the books. They can get a bit more of a feel for me, because I also am a musician and put out records, would you believe?
Oh, wow.
Or they can go to myhauntedlife2.com, and that's T-O-O, as in My Haunted Life also, but myhauntedlife2.com. And that's where they'll find probably, 4 or 5 years worth of stories and articles on the paranormal. And where, if they feel like they want to, they can submit their own experience to that website, and we'll put it up and publish it. I do kind of have a little bit of a partnership also with Darren Marler, who does the excellent Weird Darkness podcast. And he covers off of our material. We work together, so he shares the stories submitted, and he covers our stories as well. So if someone submits a story to the website, A, it'll get published on the website, and B, it may actually appear in the Weird Darkness podcast by Darren Marler, which they're fabulous things, by the way, and Darren might be another guy for you to talk to at some point.
Yeah, he definitely will keep his name in mind for a possible guest down the road here. Sounds like it'd be great to talk with him as well. All right, so once again, the book is The Chilling True Terror of the Black-Eyed Kids, a Monster Compilation. Gary, hey, thank you so much for you coming on and joining me to talk about this subject. It's been one I've been wanting to cover for a while, and it's been a pleasure.
Enjoyed it. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right. Thank you, Gary, and you have a great day. Okay, so that's going to about do it for tonight's special episode. I hope you enjoyed that discussion with Gary, and please make sure you join me next month when I'll be talking with Mark Nesbitt, and Mark has written 8 volumes of his Ghosts of Gettysburg book series. So excited to be talking with him, and that's going to be great to hear some of his stories about some of the haunts there at Gettysburg. So hopefully you'll tune in to that one as well, and hope you have a great night, and we'll see you next month.